Welcome all. Everybody has become silent all of a sudden, which is a good thing. I am Bob Smith. I am a member of Yale Blue-Green, the shared interest group for Yale alumni concerned with the environment. And by that metric, we ought to have 100% membership. We're not quite there yet, but we're working on it. We're happy to have had the opportunity to put this panel together with the assistance of our faculty co-sponsor, Tess McNamara, and we're gonna present here today a panel entitled "Greening the Existing Building Stock," and we want to send out many thanks to Planetary Solutions for giving us this opportunity and for all the work that Planetary Solutions has done in producing Climate Week at the Yale Club this week. And I want to thank Henry Kwan and the Yale Alumni Association for their continuing and invaluable support for Yale Blue-Green and all the other shared interest groups that YAA supports. I want to introduce the folks on the panel. I'll start with Tess. Tess McNamara is a senior consultant at Arup's New York office with the climate and sustainability team, specializing in decarbonization and reuse of existing buildings. Tess holds both a Master of Architecture from the Yale School of Architecture and a Master of Environmental Management from the Yale School of the Environment. She graduated summa cum laude with a Bachelor of Arts in Architecture and a Certificate in Environmental Studies from Princeton. Tess currently sits on the faculty at the Yale School of Architecture, where she teaches a course entitled Bad Buildings, Decarbonization Through Reuse, Retrofit, and Propositions. And frankly, that course, that title, was one of the inspirations for this panel. Bruce Becker, who's sitting to my immediate right, is the president of Becker & Becker, an integrated sustainable architecture and development firm in Westport, Connecticut. Bruce was appointed by President Biden in May 2024 to serve as a commissioner on the United States Commission of Fine Arts. And I was about to say, first, I don't think the administration has caught on to Bruce's subversive agenda quite yet. But frankly, I don't give him much longevity in that role, but I hope I'm wrong, Bruce. Bruce is also on the board of the Passive House Network. Bruce received a BA from Amherst College in American Studies and Fine Arts and an MBA and Master of Architecture degrees from Yale. He is a frequent lecturer and design critic at Yale and a speaker at architecture, historic preservation, and sustainable development and industry events. Ben Shepard, who is sitting to Bruce's right, is a co-managing director and the benchmarking practicing director of at Atelier 10's New York office. Ben has worked on nearly 150 high-performance projects, gaining experience in daylighting systems, stormwater management, and reuse, green roofs, rainwater energy, and battery storage. Ben holds an MFA in environmental management from the Yale School of Forestry, which is now the Yale School of the Environment, and a BA in environmental science from Northland College. David Bergman, to my far right, is going to be our moderator today. He is an architect the author and professor, and an author and professor. He's the founder of David Bergman Eco. He's the author of Sustainable Design, a critical guide, and also writes the blog ecooptimism.com, which is dedicated to the belief that positive, symbiotic solutions exist for our environmental, economic, and social issues. David is the program director for the New York School of Interior Design's Master of Professional Studies in Sustainable Interior Environments, and he's an adjunct assistant professor at the Parsons School of Design. He holds a BA in Architecture and Environment from Yale and a Master of Architecture from Princeton. He and Tess apparently went in opposite directions. Today we're going to, and David is also on the board of Yale Blue Green. He's our resident architect. Today we're going to talk about the built environment, its impact on anthropogenic global carbon emissions, and the potential role of adaptive reuse and rehabilitation of our existing building stock on mitigating that impact. Our moderator, David, is going to start things off by defining some terms of art for us so that the rest of us who are not architects have our bearings. Tess is going to give us an overview based on the work she's done at Arup on the potential of the adaptive reuse of older buildings, older office buildings in Manhattan. And Ben and Bruce are then going to dive into some real-world case studies. In the last 10 or 15 minutes, we're going to open the mic to your questions. And now, David, I'm going to turn the mic and the panel over to you. I'm out of here.
Thanks, Bob. Welcome, everybody. And I see people standing in the back. We do have a number of seats in the front row where nobody ever wants to sit, but please make use of them. So, as Bob said, what I want to do quickly is just lay the groundwork for why we're addressing this topic of greening our existing buildings. Can everybody hear me okay? And many of you, I imagine, have seen this graphic or versions of it. It dates from 2003 when an architect, Edward Masria, sort of recrunched all the numbers on greenhouse gas emissions and looked for everything that was related to buildings. And by the way, I want to mention we're talking about buildings specifically, which are, I guess, a sub-segment of the built environment, which also includes everything like roads, bridges, infrastructure, but we're focusing on buildings specifically. So he recalculated all those numbers and came up with a pretty eye-opening graphic here, and that the built environment buildings, that is, are responsible for nearly half of global greenhouse emissions. And that really pushed the profession much further than we had been going. We've been looking at greening buildings since the 1960s, really, but this put a lot more pressure on it. And by the way, when we look at cities specifically, that percentage goes even higher, simply because we drive fewer cars. This is in New York City. Buildings are responsible for 2/3 of the greenhouse emissions. And as we worked on the energy efficiency of buildings going back this number of decades, a lot of progress has been made, right? And you can see it on this graphic here. We have a lot of slides. We're all sort of visually oriented, so bear with us on those. But there's been a lot of progress made on what we refer to as operating energy of buildings. And I'd just actually like to get a sense of our audience. How many know the difference between operating and embodied energy? Okay, a fair number, but I'll go through quickly for the benefit of everyone. Operating energy is the energy that in terms of buildings, that is the energy that's used basically to run the building once it's occupied. So it's the mechanical systems, lighting, everything that's plugged in that uses energy. And that's as opposed to what we're going to talk about in the next slides. As we made more progress on operating energy, what became equally or more important was looking at what's called the embodied energy that goes into our buildings. I'm jump ahead to just slide for a second, just to clarify. The embodied energy is all the energy, and by the way, I dislike that term because the energy isn't actually embodied in the materials. It's energy expended and emissions released in the the mining or growing and refining, manufacturing, fabricating of everything that goes into a building, and further things that go into the building during its renovation, and there's even embodied energy emitted in the end of life of a building. So what we observed, coming back to this one, as we got somewhat better at operating energy, embodied energy really wasn't addressed very much, and that's now where a lot of the focus is going. And we can combine that with a number of factors that come back to why this topic is so important. One of them is time. And I think, Ben, you'll be talking a little bit about that. We are in a crisis point, really, most of us would acknowledge, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. We need to reduce them as fast as possible. Operating emissions occur over the lifespan of the building, and yes, they are critical too, but embodied emissions, or specifically what we sometimes call the upfront emissions of the materials that go into buildings, occur immediately. Right? So if we address that as much as possible, that gets us started faster on reducing carbon emissions. So they're continuing to set the stage a little bit. We can combine that with a quote that many of you have probably seen, that the greenest building is the one that's already built. And that just stands to reason, because all the emissions and all the other environmental aspects of the materials and products has already happened. We can't go back on that. It's already been expended. And with that is the sheer number of existing buildings. So if we look ahead to just a relatively short period for 2050, by far, most of the buildings that will be here are here now. So it's great to be looking at new builds, new construction, new design, and often that can be more fun looking, more sexy per se, but we really need to be addressing our existing buildings and bringing up the operating efficiency of those, along with retaining that expended embodied energy. So in short, what we come up with is that every building has an investment in materials already, and that spent embodied emissions. Every time we demolish a building, we're basically throwing away that investment. And at the same time, new construction is having to repeat that. It's throwing away an old investment and having to undertake a new investment and having new emissions for new materials. That, in short, is the major reason that we want to be greening and retaining our existing buildings. And when we do that, the size of that upfront emissions, because there are still new materials involved in renovating and upgrading a building, but it diminishes a lot. And as a way of pointing out the attention and importance of this topic. Many of you have been to all kinds of events this week. We're all deluged with things going on. I've been to, I think, 5 panels on more or less this topic, looking at circularity of materials, which is greatly overlapping with our topic, and a panel that I'm showing the title from on the right, which I'm a little bit jealous of the title because it makes the topic sound a little more sexy than our title, but it's the same material. So that just goes to show the importance of it. And on a couple of those panels, a friend of mine, happens to be a Yale alum also, some of you may know Lori Kerr, she was talking on aspects of this title, although more about operating emissions. But she said that as she's been working on this over the past couple of years, whoops, did I miss a slide? Yep, that she's never seen the industry, meaning the architecture, engineering, construction, the AEC industry, move so quickly toward a consensus as to the importance of dealing with this topic. So the way we're going to talk about this topic today is somewhat in broad terms of upgrading existing buildings, because we get basically a twofer. We get to increase the energy efficiency of those buildings by the upgrades, and we retain the embodied energy that's already been expended in those materials. We're also going to focus a little bit more specifically on conversions, or what we sometimes call adaptive reuse. And we've been doing that to varying degrees for a while. We've seen old manufacturing and loft buildings converted to residential and other uses. Basically, the idea is to take those buildings that have maybe outlived their current industry or their current use, not throw them away because of all of what I've just been stating, and find new ways to use them. And as it happens, right now, we have, post-COVID, a glut of office space. And actually, that's gotten a little better in the past couple of years. The vacancy rates have come down because more companies are getting rid of work from home allowances. But it's still pretty high. And interestingly enough, New York City apparently has the second lowest office vacancy rate of cities in this country. But even with that diminished vacancy rate, it's still a lot of open space and unused buildings. Simultaneously, we have, as I'm sure all of you know, a huge housing shortage. And that leads to a fairly logical question of, can we convert those empty spaces into housing? And it's a complex question. We may deal with some of that in here, but that's one of the ways in which we can talk about keeping our existing buildings and upgrading them by finding new applications for them. So with that, I want to turn things over to Tess.
Great. Got this.
Oh, now yours.
Should I take that? Or
Yes.
okay, perfect. Hello, everyone. Great to be with you all today. So I'm going to share a little bit of research that my team did back in 2023 around office to residential conversions. And at that time, there was a lot of hype, a lot of discussion about the feasibility of these conversions, the financial impact, the urban impact, but no one was really talking about the carbon impact of these conversions. So my team set out to essentially answer a question of how much could be saved, how much carbon could be saved if we relaxed the regulations around which buildings could be converted in the city. So this was before the City of Yes for Housing Opportunity passed, which, if you're not familiar, is a very large zoning package that was passed at the very end of 2024, so just went into effect this year. And prior to that law passing, the reality is that most buildings in the city could not actually be converted from offices to residential. So the law expanded that eligibility to all buildings built before 1990, which previously was only buildings built before 1960, with an exception in the financial district, which is where we've seen most of these conversions happening. So our study really focused on those 3 decades worth of office buildings in the city and asked, if we opened up the window for that subset of office buildings to be converted into residential, how much carbon could we save? And I'll walk through that now. So these are the resulting buildings. We've got 222 buildings from Midtown down through the financial district, from the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And to make this analysis a little bit more simple, we broke the buildings up into typologies. So we said, okay, we've got our first decade distinction, which is a rough proxy for the condition of the building, the energy use. And then we split the buildings into how wide or deep they were. So buildings with one side over 100 feet we considered to be wide, and I'll explain that in a second. And the second typological distinction was what type of facade did the building have? Was it a curtain wall building, full sort of glass, or did it have punch windows within a window wall? And I'll talk first about that first distinction with the width or depth of a building. So, residential buildings typically are 60, 70 feet wide to allow for the optimal light penetration, a double-loaded corridor, and then another set of units on the other side. So once you get over 100 feet, you end up with this sort of dead space in the middle that's not readily usable for residential space, given the light and air constraints that our residential zoning code has. So we said, okay, if a building is wide, it would probably need some sort of structural modification, some sort of carving out of the facade, or carving out an atrium to make it the most readily convertible. And in that case, that additional FAR that a developer is carving out would be added back on top as new construction. So going back to the embodied carbon footprint that David was defining, that removal of part of the building with the new construction on top has an embodied carbon footprint associated with it. So it was important for our study. The second distinction was the facade, so the punch or the curtain wall, and the type of windows in the building had an impact on both the embodied and operational emissions. We made the conservative assumption that all the windows would be replaced, because that's one big difference between offices and residential buildings. Most office buildings, you can't open the windows, they're not operable, but our residential code requires that we have operable windows in living spaces. And what that meant was we're removing all of the windows in the existing building, replacing them with new windows, which has that embodied carbon spend from the glass and the steel going into the building. But you're also able to improve the operational performance of the building by increasing the performance of the facade, reducing some of the infiltration that comes from a really old and leaky facade. So the full curtain wall replacement had actually a larger operational impact, even though it has a higher embodied carbon footprint associated with it. It was also very fun. These are the buildings from the 80s, which are just so 80s if you look at these. I wandered around New York City on like a cold November day, like 7 months pregnant, taking these photos, but it was very, very fun to kind of look at our urban fabric through this lens. So back to the initial posit that I made, which was how much carbon could we save if these 222 buildings were opened up to be converted. So that starts with, okay, well, what's our baseline? What are we measuring that savings from? And we define the baseline as business as usual condition. New York's in a massive housing crisis. The equivalent 222 buildings would need to be built somewhere else as ground up multifamily construction, inevitably. So that's that red line along the bottom, which is the footprint of building brand new from the ground up. And the other business as usual condition is if those 222 buildings were left to operate as they do today, which again, they're from the 60s, 70s, they're not good buildings, they are bad buildings. And they have, leaky facades, they're hooked on fossil fuels. And so that operational spend adds up every single year. So this graph is cumulative out to 2050. But what we saw when we considered the reuse and retrofit scenario is that you do still have an embodied carbon spend, right? From the windows, from the excavated and replaced floor area, but it's far, far lower. It's about 61% lower than the ground up multifamily construction. And we're also seeing a pretty significant reduction in the operational emissions of these buildings just by the nature of a gut renovation. You're replacing all of the systems. Again, you're improving the performance of the facade. So the ultimate take home is that we modeled a 54% reduction in emissions below the baseline case by 2050 would be feasible. There were a few interesting corollaries, which I'll touch on quickly. Have people heard of Local Law 97 in this room? Okay, some nods. Great. So this is the city's sort of landmark building decarbonization law, which is really unique in that it targets existing buildings. And these are sort of detailed graphs, but the graph on the left is the office buildings as they are today. The graph on the right is the converted scenario. And what you can see is that in 2030, which is the green line and the green bars, 10 out of 12 of our typological buildings, we're going to start to see fines every year paid to the city because they're emitting more carbon than they are allowed by the law. In the converted scenario, accounting for all of the operational efficiencies that we modeled, all of the buildings were under the limit. So it just goes to show that, incentivizing these types of conversions is a way for the city to allow developers the financial basis to actually do the upgrades that the law is trying to incentivize, which without that type of wholesale repositioning of the building are a difficult pill for people to swallow to make that type of investment in their building. The second corollary, I mentioned the full curtain wall replacement and the embodied carbon spend of replacing all of those windows with the operational carbon savings. So we actually modeled that scenario saying, how does this pan out in a whole life carbon lens out to 2050? And what we found was that you have that initial spend, you can see the red line jump up there in a theoretical 2024 when you're replacing the full curtain wall. But by 10 years out, you're starting to see overall savings based on how much more efficient your building has become because you've made your facade that much better. So this is just sort of a window into how I'm thinking about things in terms of whole life carbon in the built environment. And we saw basically the equivalent of 2.3 million passenger vehicles a year, a window of opportunity by opening up that window for conversions. We presented this to Dan Grodnick, who's the director of city planning, before they passed City of Yes, which was very contentious and narrowly passed. And he said he was going to send it to all of the city councilmen to get them to pass his zoning change. I don't know if he did, so I can't claim credit for it passing, but I like to tell that anecdote. And that's it for me. I'll pass it to Ben.
So hopefully you've been convinced now that there's a problem. If you've spent any time in buildings in New York City, you know that there's a problem. And I'm here to talk to you about, which way is it? Oop, oop. Turn it off. Green arrow. Perfect. That's also a problem. The time is a problem. Time up until 2030. We need to take action on these issues now. And in light of our current federal morass, in light of the fact that 1.5 degrees C is probably no longer achievable, according to most scientists, to stay under for climate change, we have a big problem. Anything that we do now to avoid carbon emissions has a much bigger bang for the buck, much bigger benefit than it does 20 years from now if we're going to avoid the really bad implications of the climate crisis that all of us, all of our kids, everyone will be facing. And so that's where this embodied piece really comes into play. And it's not just designing new buildings with low embodied carbon concrete, designing for circularity, for eventual reuse of new buildings. What can we do with our existing building stock? Because it's here already. There we go. So I'm going to take you on a little journey. Mayor Bloomberg back in 2010, 2011 or so had a big competition for Roosevelt Island. Cornell ended up winning that competition. Stanford also went after it. NYU went after it. And this project is a part of that in downtown Brooklyn. This is 370 J Street. And it was the, let's say, runner-up prize to not winning Roosevelt Island that Cornell eventually got and built out Cornell Tech. But NYU was very interested in having a new home and expanding beyond the West Village campus that we all know and love. And also housing a new Center for Sustainability here, CUSP. And this was a building that was essentially vacant for over 10 years. It was an old MTA administration building, mid-century modern, much like a lot of the buildings, even older than some of the buildings that Tess study was looking at in Midtown. And that's important because 500,000 square feet was just sitting there empty. It's such a failure of real estate, market economics, anything. And touring the building during the competition process, with the design team we were on, this was with a great team. Mitchell Jargaloo were the architects. BR+A was the MEP engineers. It was like a zombie horror movie going through. File cabinets overturned, papers are still on desks. It was like people were told to clear out and left the Friday afternoon and never came back. So again, you have this sitting on transit, right over a subway line. The FR is right there in downtown Brooklyn. And downtown Brooklyn has expanded greatly in the past decade plus with not only office but residential. And again, just sitting there and a huge opportunity, a block long of a building, just waiting for maybe something to happen. And at the time, there was a question of, well, let's just tear it down and start new. We could get so much more efficient with a new building, et cetera, et cetera. But NYU, to its credit, really wanted to look at the existing building. And the existing building had good bones. The structure was still there. The limestone facade, even with the sidewalk shed that was up for all the liability reasons that we see them everywhere in New York, was in good shape overall. The windows needed replacement. The facade needed some help. The interiors obviously needed to be revised. But floor to ceiling heights were pretty limited, but those challenges led to some interesting opportunities too. And I would say, any existing building, if you've done one adaptive reuse, you've done one adaptive reuse. Every building has its own unique challenges, and you don't always know until you get into the wall and really check it out and see what's going on. This goes for home renovation projects, of course, too. We can start to know what the strategies likely are, but you don't really know until you get in there. And this is a great example of just a holistic approach from both getting facade redevelopments, whole new glazing and windows involve the cassette around the windows itself, but not a whole new facade. The existing limestone facade stayed. Because of the limited floor-to-ceiling heights, we went with a DOHAS system, direct outside air system, 100% outside air ventilation with filtration, could fit in those spaces. We had more, actually, elevator banks than we needed, unlike this building. Sorry, Yale Club. Which we were able to use for vertical transportation, or change from vertical transportation to distribution for teledata, and many of the changes that need to happen in an office that was designed in the 40s and 50s to an office of today. And better indoor environmental quality too. And the daylight piece is something I'll really highlight here with the facade. Because you have a building that's essentially a city block long, and it from the north to the south orientation receives very different solar radiation throughout the day. And what we were really trying to do was not only create an architectural language here with our design team in varying the shading, varying the external louvers that were added to the facade along with the new windows to this orientation, but to help out energy, but also help out human performance, because students, faculty members, people were going to be in this space. And oftentimes, there we go. The worst thing we can do in a building is have too much daylight, which leads to glare, visual comfort issues, and people, what do? We pull blinds down. And once the blinds come down, oftentimes we don't put them back up. Oftentimes, we don't tell people that they can put the blinds up or down, too, in buildings. We don't tell them about operable windows. You buy a new bicycle, you get a 100-page user manual. You get into a new $100 million building, you get nothing. So we could do a lot better job as designers in the design and construction area, too, of telling users how to use their building. And luckily, with a building owner like NYU and CUSP, they're really interested and engaged with all of the metering and ability to look at these issues, too, and have excellent daylight, as you see here. Some of that's a programming issue, too, moving them away from perimeter offices to having more open space, and then huddle rooms and things on the inside where you can take a meeting, you can take a personal call, but leaving the exterior areas, not for private offices, which get mucked up with file cabinets and posters and other things, but having daylight access and equity for everybody in the building. There was a lot done on the energy side too, not just in terms of the envelope, but in terms of the systems. I mentioned the DOHA system already. We did demand control ventilation, looking at varying levels of occupancy. So if a conference room isn't occupied, we're not blowing the same level of air into the space as we would. That saves a ton of energy. We were able to get some NYSERDA state grants and incentives through that, about $1 million in total. And that was incentivizing what we do want, efficiency, and disincentivizing what we don't want, waste. And I would say the paybacks on these are great too. Everything, even the facade, new glazing and cassette around the windows themselves had about an 11-year payback. That's a great return. And I think the real estate development arena needs to relook at some of the returns on investment that we're looking at. If we say anything under a 4-year payback, a 25% return on investment is all we're willing to do, that's ridiculous. You might be getting that in the market right now, but you're not getting that in the long term. So we need to really rethink this existing building stock of approaching buildings with the unique qualities that they have, the challenges, floor-to-ceiling heights, et cetera, glazing, windows, everything, and thinking about not just the energy savings, but the people savings, the productivity, having better ventilation. We can do this stuff. Your designers, design teams up here have this knowledge base. We just want the projects to work on. So you see some before and after shots here, again, of the zombie apocalypse on the top row there, and then the beautiful spaces below. And again, having access to daylight. And I think one of the things that's being lost in the current conversation, and the abundance argument and everything else, get rid of regulations, get rid of permitting issues, all of that, is that if we didn't have some of that at the time, we would still have outhouses in New York City. We needed that at the time. Now, things might have changed, but let's incentivize. I think some of the argument, too, is that people don't necessarily know or care about the energy savings. Maybe the people in this room do. But when you walk into a space that is light-filled, that is of great indoor air quality, you feel it. And our hope is always that students going through this then expect this as the new baseline for buildings moving forward, whether it's institutional, where they're learning, or housing. It helps learning rates for kids as well. So all those things can work together. And, I think real estate, in a way, development was once a revered profession. It can be so again. That's something that we want to push to how do we make cities better? And this is the final quick project I'll just share. A very different project, long time coming, Moynihan Train Hall. This is the adaptive reuse of the old Farley Post Office building. We were lucky enough to work on this with SOM, Skidmore, Owings & Merrill, to transfer into the new home for Amtrak, the train hall. Again, really retaking that space, light-filled space. Yes, anything is better than Penn Station, right? Not that hard. But this space is great. And it's also the fact that there's offices now in this building on the upper levels. There is a whole new retail area that is very full during the afternoons for lunch. And if we're trying to get people into the city where we can emphasize efficiency, rely on our mass transit, which is the lifeblood of this city and any other city, these are the kind of spaces that we need to create. And so we did an after the fact. This building was already getting revitalized, wasn't a part of a repositioning aspect, but we did a life cycle analysis after the fact of looking at, okay, if we had to rebuild this today with baseline materials, steel, concrete, et cetera, what would this be like? And that's the bar on the left. It's roughly a 50% reduction in being able to reuse this. Even with all of the new steel, all the new skylights and glazing going in, we can reuse these types of spaces. And that has a huge environmental impact from not having to recreate all these materials from scratch again. And it's already located in the right space. So the final thought I'll leave you with, and we'll keep moving on, is this is a litany of strategies. There's no silver bullet approach. It has to be holistic, but we do need passive all-electric buildings that are maintained by a hopefully decarbonizing grid. That's increasingly a question these days as more offshore wind and other renewables don't get dispatched to the market. Let's talk AI later. Adaptive reuse is what we're talking about here today. Carbon sequestering materials. Again, I'm a graduate in the School of Forestry. We need the forests involved. We need ecosystems and landscapes and protecting them as well. This can't just be an argument about carbon at the end of the day. It has to be an argument about placemaking, has to be an argument about ecosystems and protecting biodiversity and all these other issues. If we just make it about the numbers of carbon and EUI, energy use intensities, we're missing the boat and we're not going to get a lot of the greater public involved in it and integrated. While those of us in the room might be very interested in the metrics and the numbers, there's a lot of people that just care about the services being delivered. And as Amory Lovins would say, they just want cold beer and hot showers. They don't really care how that electricity is created, generated to them. So let's focus on making those arguments, communicating that, and hopefully educating a whole new generation as well. Thank you.
Just a quick question for you. That huge atrium in Moynihan Hall, was that existing or was it a carve-out in the sense that Tess was talking about for conversions?
Existing except for the new skylights put in. It was all covered over. It was a lot of there were some skylights in there in the existing post office, but not to the extent that there are now. But as mail sorting facility. Daylight was actually important to them too, and I think that's something we forget about in buildings. Like even the blinds here are drawn right now. Like we should probably open them up, even though it's a rainy day.
Okay, thanks. Bruce?
Hey, that's great, Ben and Tess. Appreciate your providing the background for where we are today and what the mandate is to have a livable planet. As an architect and a developer, probably the safest thing would be to do nothing. But assuming that we want our economy to continue going, we need to find ways to build and meet needs without a carbon impact, and it's possible to do. And I think actually we know how to make buildings that don't use any operational carbon. We know how to make new buildings that embody carbon and don't have upfront carbon. But the easiest way to make a building is to reuse one that already exists, particularly if it's well located. The transportation impact of buildings is something we sometimes overlook. You could have a really green building in the suburbs that is car dependent, and that actually doesn't help. So I've always been on the lookout for buildings that are well located and that can be reused. I've been driving electric cars for a dozen years, as well as being an architect of green buildings. I'm the chairman of the EV Club of Connecticut, and I really do think that there's we don't need fossil fuels. I mean, they're something of the 20th century. And so what I'm going to talk about today is Hotel Marcel and how that can be an example of how we can reuse existing buildings. How many people in the room have actually been to this building? It's in New Haven. Okay, well, this is great. So the best way to understand this building is to stay in it and appreciate what the benefits of passive house design are. And you realize that there used to be a feeling that to have an energy efficient building that was good for the climate required some kind of compromise. What we've found is that actually enhances the quality of your experience, and it's also economically much more advantageous because if you use less energy, it's less expensive, particularly if you make it yourself. So here we are right at the entry to New Haven, right next to the two train stations and the best pizza in the world as you come in. And this is a building that has the distinction of not only being on the National Register, which actually was important for us because we use both state and federal historic tax credits to sort of offset the fact that renovations can sometimes be more expensive than new construction. When you have the tax credits, it's actually less. We also designed to LEED Platinum standards, and in fact, this is the first and only hotel that is LEED Platinum certified in the United States with a new standard, and it's also only the 10th in the history of the LEED Green Building rating system that hotels received a platinum rating. But most significantly, it's the only building, the only hotel in the United States that has a passive house certification using the EnerPHit standard, which is the passive house standard for existing buildings. I'll talk a little bit more about that now. So passive house, how many people in the room know what passive house is? Maybe you've heard of the term, but there are a lot of architects that are only becoming acquainted with this because LEED, the rating of the U.S. Green Building System, was sort of the predominant standard. I don't know that Yale has any passive house buildings on their campus, but they've got plenty of LEED buildings. But it's actually the easier standard to meet because they're just these 5 principles you have to follow. And if you follow them, you can have a building that uses less than half the energy of a conventional new code-compliant building. And they're 5 simple principles. And when you look at whether you're building a new building or renovating an existing building, if you follow these principles, you really do get a lot of bang for your buck because if you can cut the amount of energy a building uses in half, if you want to power it from renewable resources, that's half as many solar panels, or it's just half as many dollars to buy energy. So the trick to it is you have continuous installation. You can have a building meet code with certain R values in the walls and the ceilings, but if you have gaps, it can be pretty ineffective. So we are very careful about making sure the insulation, like a thermos, doesn't have any holes in it. We also eliminate thermal bridging. You can have a steel conduit that goes through the wall or a steel bracket to hold a balcony, and that defeats the purpose of your insulation. and then have airtight construction. We use blower door tests and fans to measure that. You can actually measure it now with sound as well to see if there's any transmission. And when you have airtight construction, you also have really quiet interiors. And then use high-performance windows and doors. So that is often the most vulnerable area of the building envelope. And once you have a very tight building, it's well insulated, it's important to have continuous fresh air. So we have continuous outside air that's filtered to every space and then uses energy recovery. So when you're exhausting air, it's going through energy recovery wheel to precondition the inside air. So we have this amazing Swagon energy recovery ventilator that actually recaptures about over 85% of the energy in the air that's being exhausted. So you only have to spend about 20% of what you'd otherwise have to spend to condition the air. So those are the 5 principles of Passive House. I don't see any reason why every building shouldn't be built this way. I don't know why Yale isn't building its own buildings this way. It saves money. The state of Massachusetts has studied Passive House for their apartment buildings because in Massachusetts, all multifamily housing in cities has to meet this standard. And they discovered that initially it only adds about 2%, and then once the building trades get used to it, and it actually doesn't have any additional cost. You save money on the sizing of the mechanical equipment that offsets the cost of the windows. So moving right along here, this building has sat vacant for 20 years, right at the intersection of 91 and 95. It was used as a billboard by IKEA, which had torn down the back of it, and but it had a great history as one of the first really prominent brewless buildings in the Northeast. And we discovered it and came up with this program to create a 165-room boutique hotel with a lot of meeting space. And we listed it on the National Register so we could access those credits to make the economics work. Also, to finance the project, we entered into a franchise agreement with Hilton. We're part of the Tapestry Collection, so those of you who are Hilton Honors members can earn your points there. But then we layered in the sustainability program of LEED Platinum certification, Passive House. We just decided not to use fossil fuels, which is actually one of the easiest things to decide. And that's the simplest standard. You don't need to be certified. If you don't have natural gas come into your building, or you don't have any equipment that uses fossil fuels, you're fossil fuel free. So that is the simplest and most actually unusual thing we did. So we're all electric. We're also trying to make all the energy from on-site solar, and we actually are pulling some power from a rooftop in Milford to get there, but we're still hoping to add some more solar canopies. And we also have some special tricks like power over Ethernet for all of our lighting and shades that saves energy. And we have a microgrid with 1.5 megawatts of battery storage. So that is also has real economic value. So I'm just going to go through some slides quickly to show you what it looks like. But most of you have experienced this firsthand for either meetings or overnight, or we have a great restaurant that serves breakfast, lunch, and dinner. But this is what the building looked like when we found it in 2019. The lower 2 levels had been gutted because there was asbestos on the steel. So we had a free hand in planning the building with this 5-foot module. We have 10-foot wide standard rooms and 15-foot wide deluxe rooms with sofa beds. And it really lays out very well for a wide range of unit types, including the top floor, which has these amazing executive offices with full-height wood paneling. And that's the top floor that has meeting space. This is the first use of the Mitsubishi Heat 2.0 domestic hot water system in America. A lot of the vendors we had to reach out to get them to sell their stuff because these systems were popular in Europe, but there hadn't been a demand for it in America. So this is just a way of making hot water that uses air source heat pumps, and it's less expensive to operate than gas hot water heating. And it's really the hot water system and maybe the kitchen that are the gateway drug for fossil fuel use for hotels. And so by finding those 2 solutions, and this was the harder one, we've actually eliminated the need for any fossil fuels for hotels. The kitchen is fabulous. We use a recirc hood. We've got a great chef who came out of, she was a runner-up in the Hell's Kitchen competition, and we get steady compliments for the food there that's sourced locally. We also have an all-electric laundry. This is the first hotel in the United States to use commercial heat pump laundry equipment from Electrolux. We had to persuade them to sell their products to us. It's interesting, a lot of parts of the world are already doing this. In fact, Norway has 30% of their hotels are all electric. This is the only one I'm aware of in the United States that's all electric. So there's something about America that is behind the 8 ball here. But these dryers reduced the energy use for the entire building by 20%, because it's such an energy intensive use when we put those in, because we measure our energy use. We also have 24 electric car chargers, including 12 superchargers. They're now charging a whole range of types of cars. We have a electric shuttle that will drop you anywhere in New Haven or take you to Tweed or other airports. We actually just got 3 more vehicles from Hyundai. We have the new Ioniq 9, which is a great vehicle, so we could even take you into the city if you need it. But we've sort of looked at both transportation and buildings and found that we could get to zero with fossil fuel and carbon emissions. And obviously by reusing a building, the upfront emissions are a lot less. These are graphs that are in the New York City report on looking at the 260 hotels that report energy use. And we found that Hotel Marcel has an EUI of 42 compared to often 3 times that for other hotels. We talked a little bit about the local law that will impose fines on emissions. And if you're at 0, you don't have to worry about that, because if you're the top third of emitters, you're going to get these hefty fines. But these are not just ways to avoid fines. It's a good investment, because the operator of the building is spending about a third as much money on energy as a typical building. To do this, we just had to take a new look at the exterior and insulate it from the inside, with different types of insulation to get to that passive house standard. We have these very special windows that are about 2.5 inches thick that have 3 layers of glass, have laminations that also reduce sound transmission, and there's argon in them. And they're really totally soundproof. For those of you who have stayed there, you've probably noticed how quiet they are. And that's a huge advantage. Hotel Marcel is outperforming all the other hotels in New Haven, I think for a number of reasons. One, people, particularly in New Haven, care about the climate, and they realize, if they have a choice in their consumer patterns, just like more people are buying electric cars because maybe they perform better, but also, you're less guilty driving around in an electric car. But the same thing is true with hotels, and increasingly there's an actual market for buildings that are better climate citizens. So we're finding that, in addition to the fact that you get a quieter night's sleep there. We have over 1,000 solar panels that in the summer produce more power than the building uses. And with the other solar panels that we have through community solar, we actually offset all of our energy use. We actually added more batteries, because that's in lieu of having a diesel generator, we're able to use this to shift our demand from the grid, and that saves us money. We get paid to export power. All the hotel companies have made pledges to reduce their climate impact, and so the little secret is that they're actually going in the other direction. So I think Hotel Marcel can be a model for them to meet those goals and also reduce their energy use. So I have been talking to other hotels and commercial building owners about how to decarb their buildings, but this is the quick summary of how we have done this is electrify everything, reduce energy as much as possible, and carbon emissions as much as possible by reusing buildings, and then, if possible, make the energy on site.
Thanks. So you mentioned Passive House and the fact that it's so quiet in passing, and that's actually part of one of the underemphasized benefits of Passive House is comfort. That because the shell of the building or the home, and Passive House is for any kind of building, by the way, because it's so well insulated, you don't get drafts and you don't get temperature differential. So in the worst winter day, it's just as this is the same temperature by a window as it is in the interior of the building, which is just a wonderful type of space to be in. I have lots of questions, but we have a very limited amount of time left. So I think what we should do is take some audience questions first and see how that goes. Yeah.
How much more expensive are some of these, the electric laundry machines, how much more expensive was that versus, oh, sorry. Yeah.
The crazy thing is, we actually replaced, we had resistance electric dryers, because I sort of pledged I didn't want to buy anything with fossil fuels. So I bought what I could that was electric, which were the standard electric resistance. Then when Electrolux finally agreed to sell us their units, we bought those and they cost about $100,000. We actually got a check from United Illuminating for $110,000 because the reduction of our peak energy use saved them enough money that they could justify doing that in lieu of investing in more generation. So it actually was free.
But what I'm trying to get at is, let's say, if you didn't care at all about, decarbonizing the building, like how much cheaper would your overall project costs have been?
It would be more. I mean, people don't believe me about this, but when you have a building that can have a mechanical plant that's half the size of a conventional one, it costs half as much. So it's actually less expensive to design this way.
Would this be like without incentives, like without IRA, without tax credits, or do you need the incentives to kind of make
the incentives make it more profitable to do it this way. Without the incentives, it's about a wash.
Can you talk about the measurement systems that you use to compare if you built new versus, by using the embodied carbon and just greening the existing building? That would be very helpful. And secondly, I wish you could come do my house. Does this translate to residential, or is it just impossible to make the numbers work?
Yeah, I did the same thing for my house. I took out my oil furnace and oil hot water heater and put in heat pump systems. And I think I spent about $120,000 to do that, and I put solar panels on. I think the payback was about 6 years. So it's like getting a 12% return on an investment in the stock market, except for you're investing in your house.
Yeah, and I can speak a little bit about the embodied carbon measurement system. I think I always tell my students this: embodied carbon is hard because you can't measure it. It's all an estimate. We're taking a guess basically at how much we think goes into a building. You can try to get as specific as you can, but we're not. People do it different ways. There have been a lot of studies recently that have given the same building to 3 different practitioners, and the footprint that they came up with was a 30% margin of error between 34%, thank you, which is really significant. And there's a lot of effort in the industry to try to standardize that, to try to, the SEI 2050 just came out with a structural engineering focused standard that says exactly what you need to count and what you need to include. In the case of this study, for that baseline condition, we used an industry standard benchmark for new construction in New York, which is like 500 kilograms of CO2 equivalents per meter squared. And then for the converted scenario, we were looking at some facade benchmarks that have come from Payette, that has this facade tool that gives you, the different life cycle stages for windows, curtain walls, and things like that. And we use similar benchmarks for just concrete and steel for looking at that. excavation and rebuilding on top. But it's a huge point of discussion in the industry right now, because it's not like you can just pull from an energy meter, that's telling you how much energy you're using so you can calculate your operational footprint. It's much more complicated, and we're getting there with the data. There's a lot of different folks, some from Yale. I don't know if any of you know Jack Rusk. You do, Joya, coming up with C-Scale, which is an amazing tool that lets you do an approximation very quickly to try to level that playing field and understand apples to apples when you're looking at different projects. But we still have a long way to go.
Just to pile on, I mean, if you measure it, it matters. That's what I learned from Marion Chertow and Tom Gradle and Yale Industrial Ecology. And we're having, critically to Tess's point, these discussions now with the architectural teams as they're going forward on projects. Should my facade be terracotta, aluminum, steel? What's the right mix of that? How do I reduce the amount of materiality in that facade and still have the operational performance that we want, but lessen that embodied carbon impact? And there's a lot going on at the state level too, with things like concrete and the amount of carbon that can be in the concrete. And because it's a local game, the concrete only comes from so far to every job site. And so that's really an area where we've seen huge momentum on the construction side of competition increasing on how low can you go in terms of the materiality in picking it. So it's not just about operational and aesthetics anymore, it's also about the materiality.
You may have mentioned this, but is there a group is there one industry group that's trying to consolidate and do this measurement, or is it by nature of many?
Yeah, there are a few. The Carbon Leadership Forum is, I think, the largest one. There are also some great Yale alums working for that organization, and they've published a lot of the benchmarking studies saying where different buildings have published results. And then some of them are more industry specific. So structural engineering is a big focus, because our structure is often 80% of the upfront carbon of a building. So hopefully that everyone can coalesce.
And in terms of materials and the embodied emissions from there's been a whole host of programs trying to do that. And they're just now coming together in something called the Common Materials Framework, which is going to tie the certifications together.
And I'm shocked there hasn't been a mass timber question yet already. But I mean, that's another great way to get this. And mass timber projects are popping up all over. We've got them at Princeton, at UMass Amherst, just finished one at University of Arkansas, Teddy Roosevelt Presidential Library opening next summer. Those are all mass timber projects and able to take advantage of, our hopefully regionally grown material resource.
Great information, thank you. Are there any characteristics of an older building where a retrofit is not wise?
I would say you could throw a lot of good money after bad too. Asbestos is a big issue, certainly, in that remediation of things. Maybe it doesn't suit your program anymore. We see that a lot on university institutional campuses, where a lot of modernist buildings, for instance, were designed one way and aren't very flexible. And so I think, yes, for sure. And then, we're then talking a lot about how do we recycle as much of that building material as possible and avoid landfill. And then that's where a lot of the circularity conversations now are happening, of how do you make a building adaptable for the future? Because we put all of this energy and engineering into buildings now. How does it maintain flexibility for the next generation? And that's happening a lot in laboratories. And there's a big push and pull between flexibility and adaptability. Everybody says that, well, we want it to be completely flexible. Well, there's a penalty to be paid for that too. You might put in a ton more structure, a ton more systems that you necessarily don't need. And so we're always trying to find that sweet spot.
I think we have time for one more quick question.
So I'll add on to your, thank you, Arup. So I'm Rama from Autodesk, and we recently ran a program under the WBCSD, which, if you were here for the last panel discussion, right? So direct competitors, Arup, AECOM, Ramble, SOM, Foster & Partners, and Arcadis. got together. We gave them one building, and it's a free model that anybody could have done this research. We're not advocating for Autodesk, and it's anybody's BIM. And they spent over a year assessing the embodied carbon of that same building and came to a 34% variation. And then we just spent another year. The paper was just published on Thursday, and it gives step-by-step guidelines on how best to prepare your BIM so that you can report out and have a better embodied carbon and reduce the embodied carbon variation. And I will say it was done by 2 former Atelier 10 employees and 1 who's a Yale architecture graduate. So really was an incredible program, and the idea was not that these 6 companies are the be-all and end-all, but if we can compare apples to apples and standardize a little bit and have some guidelines so that you can communicate better about what's happening and be transparent about what you're measuring, the results will be better. So.
Just to clarify for the non-architects and engineers here, BIM is Building Information Modeling, which is kind of an advanced CAD drafting system.
Yes, thank you.
So I guess I'd like to close out with one forward-looking question and just ask each of you fairly briefly, if you can, what's, in your opinion, the most important next step in advancing this whole concept of retaining and greening existing buildings? What's needed?
Quickly say, I mean, the whole world of sustainability and the corporate and university world has been about measuring things. I think now there has to be accountability for actually putting carbon into the atmosphere. I would advocate that every organization should have one person that has to grant waivers when you make a decision that contributes to climate pollution.
So that's looking at the streamlining regulations aspect.
Creating accountability, not just measuring, but the CFO or the Chief Sustainability Officer has to be personally responsible for saying, yes, it's okay to buy this gas van, or it's okay to make this concrete, and then explain why. Because right now, everyone's just measuring things, and what does that do for us?
I just think some humility in the design process. We can always design better. We can always learn from each new project. We can always, I mean, it's the stories, but it's also the mistakes. It's where you get hit in the nose and you wouldn't do something again. Oh, I wouldn't do a microturbine that uses natural gas, in a building now. Those kinds of challenges and things. And education, I mean, that's why we're all educators in some way, and outreach and doing these things. And for the next generation too, I want this to be a world that my son can live in and not have to take, a snorkel in his book bag to school every day on the subway because it might flood.
Yeah, I think, we saw great examples from these 2 about, buildings for large, wealthy institutions. I think the problem that I see when you think about New York City specifically is the bulk of our issue is the smaller buildings with the unsophisticated landlords, the co-ops, the condos, and for them the problem is really financing. Because if you're doing a wholesale, adaptive reuse building where you're raising a bunch of money, you have some wiggle room to play with. But if you're looking at just a building that baseline, is breaking even in terms of operating cost, how do you convince them to do a $5 million renovation? And a lot of the tax incentives now are retroactive, so it doesn't help with writing that initial check. So I think from my perspective, anything that reduces that initial cost is what's going to move the needle the most, whether that's more favorable financing for electrification projects or direct kind of rebates for technology purchases. The other thing that I think a lot about is our solution now for heating is a heat pump, which generates hot water, not steam. But the distribution system in our buildings are all built for steam, and you can't just run hot water through a steam radiator. It doesn't work. So I think there are industrial heat pumps that will generate steam from electricity, but if we get that to a residential scale, we're going to have a bit much easier time electrifying our building stock in New York specifically and along the East Coast.
And to that end, there's the New York Accelerator Program, which is trying to get through to smaller building owners. I know that I live in a relatively small former tenement building, and trying to upgrade that with limited resources and a small, not landmark building is tough. And I wanted to end on a positive aspect, but you talked about rebates and such. Do you see the repealing of parts of the IRA as having a significant effect, or will this go on without?
I think we will continue on. You know, I think the reality is that 179D, I didn't see it have a huge impact in the short period of time that it was enacted. I think because you need that larger institutional knowledge to understand how to actually get the tax incentive, but also you need to still write that upfront check, and maybe you'll get it in your tax, you know, at the tax season, but it doesn't help.
Yeah, and while the 30% tax credit on solar has gone away, solar panels are 30% less expensive than they were like 3 years ago. So I think it's too bad, but I think we'll manage around it.
And 90% less expensive than they were 10 years ago. And utility costs are only going up and up because of all these pressures on the grid. And then you have all of the health benefits, like your all-electric kitchen. Look at the benefit of that for not having gas in a small space and heating up a space and all of those. So I think we're going to see a big shift back to the people side and expounding the health benefits as well as trying to reduce the utility cost aspects. And I think solar installers, for instance, are just going to have to get more efficient in their installations. Why does it cost 3 or 4 times more here to install a rooftop solar unit than it does in Australia or other places? And that's been well documented. And so if they want to survive, they're going to have to get much more efficient on the installs.
Well, thank you for turning my sort of pessimistic question into an optimistic set of answers. And with that, I think we're out of time, right? Okay. So,